From next month, you will pay to breathe in this house, or you can get out," my stepdad said as he slid an invoice across the dinner table toward me. The paper scraped against the wood with a slow, deliberate sound, the kind that makes your stomach tighten even before your mind understands why. It was a Sunday evening in March, the kind of quiet Idaho night where the sky outside our window still held the last traces of golden light. My mother had just set down a plate of roast meat, her hands trembling slightly the way they did on days when her heart medication left her tired. She did not even have time to sit before Gary reached into the folder he had kept tucked beside his chair. He pulled out a single sheet of white printer paper and placed it right in front of my plate. The title at the top read, "Monthly Charges for Quinn." Under it, he had itemized every line with the neatness of someone who enjoyed the cruelty of precision. $400 for rent. 1/3 of the electric, water, and internet bills. A maintenance fee he labeled household wear and tear. And the last line, typed in bold, said emotional stress compensation, $150. My mother blinked twice, confused, thinking it had to be some kind of joke. She even gave a soft laugh, the nervous kind, and said, "Gary, come on, this is ridiculous." But the way he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, chin tilted in triumph, made it clear he was not joking. He handed her a pen and tapped the bottom corner of the page. "Sign here to acknowledge you have reviewed the new arrangement." Her smile slowly vanished as the realization sank in. Gary pressed his finger on the paper again and said the words that split our home in half. "Separate budgets. No more freeloading. You either pay or pack." His voice carried that tone he used when he wanted to sound fair but really wanted to dominate the room. What he did not know was that the stack of bills he claimed to shoulder was mostly mine. For 2 years, I had paid quietly and consistently because my mother hated conflict and believed peace was worth any cost. I paid the electric bill when it doubled after Gary bought his enormous television. I paid for her medications every month without fail. I slipped her money when Gary refused to cover her appointments, and she would tell him some friend from church helped her out. I paid because she had lived her whole life carrying other people and deserved at least one person willing to carry her. But Gary had never noticed anything beyond his own reflection. My mother tried to speak gently. "Gary, maybe we can talk about this later. Maybe this is not the best way." He cut her off with a bitter laugh. "I have supported you and your daughter long enough. She is 27, not 17. If she really has a job, she should not have a problem with this." His eyes flicked toward me with a smirk like he expected me to explode or beg or somehow prove his point. Instead, I picked up the paper and looked at it closely. My pulse did not even rise. I had endured worse. I had swallowed worse. I had absorbed his comments about my work for years. "She just draws cute little buttons for apps. That is not real work. Kids these days think tapping a laptop is a career." What I did not tell him was that just hours before dinner, my phone had pinged with an email notification. "Your portfolio has crossed $1.9 million. Congratulations." I had closed the email instantly. Some truths belong to the person who earned them and to no one else. Gary leaned forward, fingers steepled together. "So what is it going to be? Pay your share or pack your things?" His confidence filled the room like a bad smell. This was the moment he believed he had finally put me in my place. He did not notice my mother's shoulders hunch in embarrassment or the way she refused to meet my eyes. He only saw himself. I set the paper down slowly, almost gently, as if it were not the single most insulting thing anyone had ever handed me. Then I looked up and smiled. "Separate budgets. Sure, Gary. Let us do it properly." My mother flinched at the calm in my voice. She knew me well enough to recognize when something inside me had shifted out of reach. What Gary did not know, what he could not possibly imagine, was that the words he delivered with such pride were about to unravel everything he thought he controlled. I agreed that night. What he did not know was that those words would cost him his marriage, his reputation, and the only roof over his head. And it all started in the kitchen when his wife finally saw what I had done and screamed so loud the neighbors ran over. Before I tell you what she saw in that kitchen, tell me in the comments if anyone has ever tried to put a price tag on your existence. I read every single one. Boise in early spring has a quiet kind of stillness that settles over the cul-de-sac just before sunset. The kind of calm that makes every sound inside a house feel louder and sharper. And as I walked through our small front yard, the morning after Gary handed me that so-called invoice, I noticed how peaceful everything looked. From the outside, the trimmed lawns, the single-story homes lined neatly beside one another, the soft chatter of older neighbors tending to their roses, all of it giving the illusion that this was the kind of neighborhood where families felt safe and supported. Yet behind our front door, a very different truth had been brewing for years without anyone knowing. I grew up in Boise, and even after moving around for work, I returned to help my mother when her health began to fail. At 27, I worked as a lead UI and UX consultant for several SaaS companies scattered across Seattle, Austin, and San Francisco. My projects kept me busy at almost all hours, and my income was more than comfortable. But because I worked from home with a laptop and a tablet, Gary constantly dismissed what I did by calling it computer doodling or screen tapping. He believed real work involved sweat and steel and long hours on his feet, and he never missed a chance to remind both me and my mother that he was the man of the house. And we were lucky he kept a roof over our heads. My mother, Linda, had married him when I was 22 after years of trying to rebuild her life, following a severe accident that left her with lingering heart issues and constant fatigue. She worked part-time at a local grocery store as a cashier, and even though the job was not too demanding, her medication and blood pressure scares kept her exhausted more often than not. She was 55 but carried the weight of someone who had spent her entire life putting everyone else first. And Gary knew it, which was part of why he spoke to her the way he did, slow enough to sound patient, but sharp enough to remind her of her dependence on him. He was 58 and worked as a maintenance supervisor at a warehouse on the outskirts of Boise, a job that kept him busy, yet also fed his self-importance. Because he often said that without his ability to fix things, the world around him would simply collapse. And in our home, he behaved as if every lamp, every wall, every piece of furniture existed solely because he allowed them to. What he never acknowledged, and never wanted to acknowledge, was that this house he claimed as his territory was not built on his effort alone. 40% of the down payment came from the settlement. Money my mother received from her accident. Money she would have held on to for her long-term care if I had not helped her invest it carefully so it grew rather than disappeared. She used it to secure a home because she believed stability would heal both of us, and Gary walked into that stability as if it had always belonged to him. Last year, when a storm damaged the roof and the repair quote came back higher than expected, Gary complained for days about how unfair it was that he had to shoulder everything. And when I quietly transferred 70% of the payment directly to the contractor, he simply nodded and said, "Good, you should contribute more," as if the cost had been his burden all along. The memory of that moment still stung because his gratitude lasted less than a minute before he launched into one of his long monologues about responsibility and discipline. My mother often apologized to me in private, whispering that she did not mean for things to turn out this way, that she had hoped Gary would be someone who cared for us both. But she had spent so many years afraid of being alone that she let his words override her instincts, and she accepted his attitude with a kind of quiet helplessness that broke my heart more than his insults ever did. A deeper betrayal had been hiding beneath all of that, though tucked in the way Gary casually presented paperwork to us at random times and told us to sign here. It is just refinancing the loan, or it is only for insurance purposes. And I signed because at the time I believed he would never use my name in any way that harmed the household. But looking back, I realized he never explained anything fully. He just pointed to places and waited, and my mother trusted him far more than she should have. That morning, as I tried to clear my thoughts, I walked to the kitchen to start breakfast for my mother. She was still asleep due to a rough night with her blood pressure, and I wanted her to wake up to something warm. I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator to look for a measuring cup and instead found a stack of envelopes pushed carelessly toward the back. Most were old statements we had already handled, but one had not been opened, and my name on the top left corner made my stomach tighten with a strange intuition. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out a document, thicker than a normal letter, and as I unfolded the pages, my pulse slowly rose. It was a statement from the bank regarding a home equity line of credit, a HELOC tied to our house, and my name appeared directly beneath Gary's as a co-borrower. The amount drawn was $40,000, and the signing date was the same week he had complained outrageously about the cost of that new television in the living room, a purchase he insisted he paid for because he deserved something nice after working so hard. I stared at the page, unable to decide whether I felt anger or disbelief first. The signature on the page looked like mine, but the memory of signing anything like this did not exist. He had either slipped it into a pile of documents he told me were routine, or forged my approval without hesitation, and no matter which version was true, the betrayal had crossed a line that could not be undone. I folded the paper slowly, thinking of the invoice he handed me the night before, thinking of the way he smiled as if I were some burden he had carried alone, thinking of my mother, who would be devastated if she learned he had used her accident money to secure a house, only to gamble its value behind her back, and something inside me settled with a clarity that felt both cold and steady. This was the beginning of the end for him, even if he did not know it yet. The days that followed my discovery of the HELOC papers moved slowly in that heavy way, where every sound in the house felt sharper, and every word spoken seemed to carry its own shadow. And as I tried to focus on work from my corner of the living room, I could hear Gary chatting loudly with two of his friends who had stopped by after their shift. They sat around the kitchen counter eating chips straight from the bag, while my mother folded laundry near the doorway, and I had barely opened my laptop when I heard him say in that smug tone he used whenever he felt the need to impress someone that all I did was design cute little buttons for apps, that it was not real work, and that kids these days believed typing counted as a job. His friends laughed the way men laugh when they want to show loyalty rather than genuine amusement, and my mother glanced at me with an apologetic smile, a silent plea asking me not to take it to heart. But I could feel something inside me stiffen, as if his words were a hand pushing me backward. I tried to ignore it by concentrating on my screen, on the mock-up I needed to revise for a client in Austin, but the sound of the television turning on in the next room reminded me that the electric bill had doubled ever since Gary discovered streaming documentaries every afternoon, a habit that lasted so long I often had to raise my voice to ask him to lower the volume while I was in meetings. I paid that bill without mentioning it because my mother had once whispered that she did not want another argument, she just wanted peace, and I agreed not because I was weak, but because anger had become too exhausting to feel every single day. My mother's medication refill came that same week, and when I picked it up after a client call, the cashier recognized me and asked how my mother was doing. He had seen me so many times over the past 2 years that he no longer needed to ask who the prescription belonged to, and I paid the $140 without blinking because it was nothing compared to the relief of knowing she would be stable for another month. Yet the moment I walked through the front door, Gary asked why I was late from work since he thought sitting at home made it impossible to have traffic delays. A few days later, his old truck made a strange grinding sound. As he pulled into the driveway, he popped the hood and cursed loudly before announcing that something serious had broken, and he did not have the money to fix it until his next paycheck. And my mother shot me that same pleading look she always used whenever she wanted me to help, without directly asking, so I paid for the repair, even though the amount was more than I thought it would be, and Gary accepted it with a nod that barely lasted half a second before he returned to yelling at the game on television. The imbalance between what I gave and what he took had always existed, but after finding those HELOC papers, it felt heavier, like the ground beneath the house had begun to tilt, and I started seeing signs of disrespect everywhere I looked. That following Monday, 2 FedEx boxes arrived addressed to me, one labeled UX Summit Speaker Kit and the other Conference Badge San Diego, both representing the time and effort I had spent building a reputation in my field, and I placed them on the table so I could open them after finishing a call. But when Gary walked by, he shoved them to the side with a careless swipe of his hand and muttered that it was all useless stuff anyway, as if those boxes did not symbolize opportunities I had earned through years of hard work. His dismissiveness stung in a way that left me sitting in silence for a few seconds, breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, because he spoke without realizing the depth of his cruelty, dismissing not just the surface of my work, but the entire identity I had fought to create for myself. I remembered the moment at dinner when he handed me that invoice and felt a similar sensation. Now, a mix of insult and disbelief that someone could reduce my life to such condescension, and I wondered how many women lived in houses where their accomplishments were minimized until they felt like background noise. As if sensing the weight of my thoughts, my phone buzzed on the table beside me, and the subject line of the email lit up the screen with an invitation that should have filled me with pride rather than the ache that followed. A major UX conference in Chicago requested me as a keynote speaker, offering $25,000 as an honorarium, and the message congratulated me for my influence in the field, for the articles I had written, and the panels I had spoken on, for the innovations I had helped companies shape without ever leaving my desk. I reread the email 3 times while imagining the applause the crowd would make, imagining the badge I would wear and the connections I would build, imagining a version of myself that lived without constraints and did not need to balance her future against the fragile heart of the woman she loved most. But I knew my mother had been dizzy for 3 mornings in a row, that her medication adjustment was making her nauseous, that she relied on my presence far more than she admitted, and the thought of leaving her for several days scared her, even if she never said it aloud. So I typed a polite decline, saying the timing did not align with current obligations, and as I pressed send, I could feel something small inside me break, not loudly and not dramatically, but with the quiet resignation of someone who had been choosing family over self for far too long. When I walked into the living room, Gary looked up from his recliner and smirked at the expression on my face, as if he sensed a new vulnerability he could use against me. And as I passed by him, I thought to myself that sometimes the smallest sacrifices become the seeds of the strongest revenge. Have you ever had someone dismiss your entire career with one sentence? The night Gary handed me that invoice lingered in my mind like a bruise that kept darkening with each passing hour, and even though several days had gone by since he slammed the paper on the dinner table, the memory still returned with the same sharpness every time I passed through the dining room, as if the air itself held on to the echo of his voice. I kept replaying the moment he leaned forward with that self-satisfied tilt of his chin, the way he pointed at the paper as though he were delivering some form of noble justice, instead of an insult meant to reduce me to a child begging for permission to exist. And the sting of it felt deeper, now that I knew about the HELOC hidden in the drawer, the mortgage he claimed as his responsibility, while using my name to leverage the value of the house. The house, he insisted, was his domain because he was the one who signed the monthly checks. That night after dinner, my mother had tried to clear the plates before Gary started complaining about the water spots on them, her hands shaking as she reached for the faucet, and Gary snapped that he was not an ATM, and from next month not a single cent of his money would go toward me. And even though he had said variations of those words countless times before, something about his tone felt more deliberate, like he wanted to make sure the message sunk in deeply enough to hurt. My mother had looked between us with a mixture of fear and guilt, her voice wavering as she said, "Gary, it is still her home. She's your stepdaughter, not a stranger." And the second the words left her lips, he turned on her with a rage that made her flinch. He thundered that it was his mortgage and his rules, and if he said separate budgets, then that meant complete separation. No more mixing expenses, no more pretending everything was shared, and he ended it with a glare in my direction as if daring me to challenge him. I did not rise to the bait because there was nothing to be gained from matching his volume. Instead, I lifted the crumpled invoice from the table and asked, in the calmest voice I could manage, whether separate budgets meant every expense had a name on it, whether everything should be labeled clearly without confusion. And he gave a short bark of laughter as he said, "Exactly, that was the entire point. It was time for accountability." He expected me to argue, to protest, to fall apart the way he always assumed I would when pushed. But instead, I nodded slowly and told him that if separate budgets were what he wanted, then we should do it properly. Each expense accounted for, cleanly with no overlap, and Gary smirked as though he had finally bent me into understanding my place. My mother seemed to sense something different in the air because her expression shifted into a worried kind of stillness, as if she knew I was agreeing too easily, too quietly, and she watched me all evening with the unsettled look of someone waiting for a storm. After she went to bed and Gary settled into his recliner to watch a late-night reality show, I retreated to my room and opened my laptop, not to work on the deadlines stacked in my inbox, but to open a blank Excel workbook, my fingers moving automatically as I typed the name of the file who really paid for this house in a simple font that looked almost too gentle for the weight of what it represented. I created tabs methodically, one for utilities, one for medical bills, one for repairs, one for groceries, each tab a reflection of the invisible work I had carried for years without recognition. And as I filled in the first few rows, I felt a quiet clarity settle over me, steady and cold and reassuring in a way that anger had never been. Outside in the living room, Gary shouted at the television about a contestant making a stupid decision, the kind of pointless noise he produced whenever he believed no one was paying attention to him. And he complained loudly that the internet kept lagging, which made the show buffer at the worst moments. He swore under his breath about how nothing ever worked the way it should, and that he would have to call the provider again, which was ridiculous because he paid enough money for decent service. The irony washed over me slowly, because I knew internet service had been on my auto pay for nearly 2 years. I knew he had not covered a single bill in that span of time. And the bitterness of his complaint almost made me laugh as I typed line after line into the spreadsheet. The night stretched deeper as I pulled up PDFs, receipts, old statements, notifications, buried in email threads, and each number I typed into the workbook felt like restoring a piece of truth he had spent years burying under his self-proclaimed authority. But the real shift happened when I opened a separate browser tab to check on something that had nothing to do with the house at all. I logged into my brokerage account out of habit, expecting to glance at it quickly before turning off the lights, yet when the page loaded, the number staring back at me made my breath still for a moment. $1,932,000, a balance built from years of careful investing and long nights of work and steady discipline, the kind of number that could reshape a future in ways Gary never imagined because he never once cared to ask. I watched the account summary glow on the screen and felt the contrast between my quiet financial world and Gary's constant complaints filling the living room, the sound of him cursing because he thought the internet would fail again if I did not pay for my share soon enough, and the absurdity of it all settled into something razor sharp. As he shouted about fairness and responsibility from a room away, I closed my laptop with a softness that felt almost ceremonial, knowing in that exact moment that the separate budgets he demanded would be the very thing that undid him completely. When I woke the next morning, the house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy rather than peaceful. And as I sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop open, I knew it was time to quantify every unseen thing that had kept this household standing for the last 3 years. So I pulled the spreadsheet back up and began gathering every bill I could find, every receipt tucked into drawers, every digital notice buried in my email. And the deeper I went, the more startling the numbers became. I counted 26 utility bills where the payments came directly from my account, each one a reminder of evenings spent working, while Gary watched television loudly enough to shake the walls, and I listed 8 separate repair invoices covering problems he had shouted about for weeks, before I eventually called someone to fix them, from the leaking sink to the broken garage sensor to the oven that mysteriously stopped heating after Gary slammed it shut too hard. Then there were the grocery trips, more than 30 documented purchases of necessities that appeared in the fridge without anyone questioning where they came from. Items my mother needed for her diet. The fresh produce she could digest on her bad days. The vitamins her doctor recommended, all of which I paid for quietly because it was easier than listening to Gary complain that groceries were my responsibility if I kept eating like someone who had never lived through hard times. I added them all to the spreadsheet line after line and started assigning values to each act, looking up the hourly rate of a caregiver for the times I sat beside my mother during her dizzy spells, researching the average cost of a house cleaner for the weekends. I scrubbed the kitchen because the smell of grease made her nauseous, copying the numbers for a financial assistant. When I balanced the budget, she was too tired to manage, and each calculation felt like tracing the outline of a life I had lived without acknowledging how much of myself I had poured into this place. It struck me in a slow, painful wave that for 3 full years I had operated as the household manager, the primary caretaker, the quiet provider, and none of it had ever been recognized, not even in the smallest way, and seeing it laid out on the screen made my chest tighten with a mix of pride and grief, because it hurt to realize how invisible I had been in my own home. After hours of compiling and verifying the numbers, I printed 3 copies of the completed statement, each one stapled neatly with the totals, bolded at the bottom, and I placed 1 copy in my mother's room on her nightstand, knowing she would read it slowly with her gentle, careful eyes. Then I laid a 2nd copy on the kitchen counter where Gary loved to slam his keys every morning on his way to work, and the last copy I taped to the inside of the cabinet, where the plates were stacked, the cabinet he opened every evening without thinking, the one place he would see the truth, without being able to avoid it. Before closing the spreadsheet, I clicked back to the tab with the HELOC details, feeling the same unease from the night before, and the balance glared back at me with a clarity that turned my stomach. $40,000 withdrawn under the category of house improvements money that should have gone toward essential repairs, a fund meant to bolster the value of the home. Yet the only new item in the house was the 85-inch television Gary bragged about buying with his own earnings. I stared at the numbers and felt the sting of betrayal deepen, not because he spent the money unwisely, which he did, but because he spent it without telling my mother, without telling me, and without considering the danger of leveraging a home that was not solely his to begin with. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed clarity from someone who understood the legal implications. So I scheduled a quick Zoom call with my friend Maya, a lawyer in Seattle who handled financial disputes and estate matters. And during my lunch break, I sat on my bed with my back against the wall and showed her the HELOC statement through the camera, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my hands. Maya read the document carefully, her eyebrows pulling together as she flipped through the pages on her screen. And after a long pause, she said in a low, thoughtful voice that, if I ever wanted to pursue this further, there were many things I could legally do with the information, that using someone's name in a secured loan without proper disclosure was not something courts took lightly, and that my mother had rights in this situation that Gary might not be prepared for. I listened quietly, absorbing every word, and when the call ended, I sat still for a long time, my laptop cooling against my legs, realizing that for the first time in years, I had leverage, not just emotional leverage, but financial and legal power that could shift the entire balance of the household. In that moment, the weight of the spreadsheet, the invoices, the secret loan, and the years of invisible labor crystallized into something sharp and resolute, and I felt a new steadiness inside me, as if every quiet act of love I had ever given was finally visible, not just to me, but soon to everyone involved. If you had to bill someone for every invisible thing you do at home, how big would the number be? By the time the spreadsheet had been printed and placed around the house, something inside me had already shifted, not loudly and not in anger, but in a quiet, decisive way that felt almost like the beginning of a new rhythm. And the next morning, I drove to the nearest office supply store with a sense of purpose I had not felt in months, walking through the aisles until I found a pack of bright labeling stickers and a thick black Sharpie items that seemed almost childish, yet carried a weight far greater than their size. Then I ordered a small cabinet lock through an online store to arrive the following day, because separate budgets would require separate spaces, and I intended to follow the rules Gary had demanded with more precision than he ever imagined. When I returned home, my mother was folding laundry at the dining table, her motions slow and deliberate the way they were on mornings when her blood pressure acted up, and she watched curiously as I placed the labels and the Sharpie on the counter, asking gently what I planned to do, her voice catching slightly, as though she already sensed a storm gathering. I opened the refrigerator without answering right away and began writing on the first label, "Paid by Quinn," not from Gary's budget, before placing it on the carton of milk. Then I moved to the eggs, the yogurt, the meat I bought for dinner, repeating the same line with steady handwriting, and with each item tagged the air in the kitchen seemed to thicken with a tension neither of us acknowledged. I reached for my mother's heart medication next the orange bottle she kept on the middle shelf so she would not forget to take it, and I wrote "Covered by Quinn" since 2021 in careful script before placing it back exactly where it belonged. My mother stared at the label with a mixture of embarrassment and sadness and asked in a small voice whether I was taking things too far, whether this would upset Gary more than necessary. But I touched her shoulder gently and told her I was only following the rules he set, that separate budgets meant clarity and accountability and clearly marked responsibility, and she fell silent at that. Her lips pressed together, as if she understood the logic, even though her heart still resisted the confrontation. I continued placing labels on every item I had purchased, moving to the pantry and adding tags to the coffee grounds, the cereal, the baking supplies, and even the olive oil, each label, a reminder that despite his loud claims, Gary had not contributed as much as he liked to pretend. And when I finally stepped back and surveyed my work, the kitchen looked like a catalog of truth that had been hidden far too long. It did not take long for Gary to notice he walked into the kitchen later that afternoon humming loudly and opened the fridge to grab a drink. And when he saw the first label, he snorted with a laugh that carried a sharp edge and said so childish as though the sight amused him. But when his eyes moved from one shelf to another and he realized every item he reached for bore my name instead of his own, his smirk faltered, the muscles in his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He opened the pantry next, perhaps expecting fewer labels there, but the bright stickers with my handwriting greeted him from every shelf, and by the time he shut the pantry door, a faint crease had formed between his brows, a small sign that the imbalance he once denied was now impossible to ignore. I placed the small cabinet lock in my room until it arrived the next day, and while Gary continued to mutter under his breath, I walked to my desk to review a few documents for one of my clients, a quiet ritual I had built over years, and on the desk sat a folder labeled Quinn Drew UX LLC Contract in simple, clean lettering, a label I used for organization, but one that revealed more truth than Gary had ever asked about. He'd always assumed I worked for someone else, imagining me as a low-level designer, chasing small contracts, never realizing that I ran my own consultancy with multiple clients, relying on my expertise, and that folder sat there now as a quiet reminder of the life he never bothered to understand. The more he saw my name across the kitchen, the more agitated he became, pacing around the house in short bursts and complaining loudly to my mother about how unnecessary and disrespectful it all was, ignoring the fact that the system was entirely his idea, a rule he had created without considering what would happen if someone actually followed it. That evening, after he finally retreated to the living room to watch television, I opened my laptop again and logged into the utility provider's website, scrolling through the account settings until I found the billing responsibility section, and with a steady calm, I switched the primary payer from my name to his, the confirmation email arriving in my inbox within seconds, with the subject line, Billing. Responsibility changed successfully. I repeated the process for the electric service next, moving through each step carefully until that confirmation email appeared as well. Then I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet satisfaction settle through me, knowing that for the first time, Gary would be financially responsible in the exact way he had demanded. As I closed my laptop, I could hear him shouting at the television from the other room, complaining again about the internet lag and how unfair it was that nothing ever worked properly. And I knew that within a month, the bills would bring him face to face with the truth he had spent years avoiding, a truth written on every label in the kitchen and embedded now in every account transfer I had quietly completed. The shift in the house after I labeled everything was subtle. At first, a strange stiffness in the air that grew heavier each day, and I could tell Gary was simmering beneath the surface even when he pretended not to care. Pacing from room to room with the restless energy of someone who felt control slipping from his fingers yet refused to admit it. By the end of the week, he had reached a new level of irritation, muttering constantly about respect and responsibility. And on Friday afternoon, he came home from work with a forced cheerfulness in his voice, announcing loudly that he had invited Mr. Brown and Ms. Eliza over for dinner on Sunday, two neighbors he trusted to validate his version of events, because they had known him longer than they had known my mother or me. The smile he wore when he delivered the news was the kind that hid a plan, and I knew instantly what he intended to do because I had seen the pattern before, the way he gathered an audience whenever he wanted to reinforce his authority, turning dinner into a stage and the people around him into spectators. My mother looked uneasy the moment she heard their names, her eyes darting toward me as though she feared how the evening might unfold. But she nodded quietly and asked what meal he wanted her to prepare, her voice carrying the resignation of someone who had spent too many years smoothing the edges of a man determined to make every situation revolve around his ego. I did not offer to cook as I usually did on Sundays, partly because I wanted him to feel the absence of my efforts, and partly because I knew this dinner was not about food, it was about the performance he intended to give the narrative he would try to push. When Sunday arrived, the house was spotless because my mother had cleaned all morning despite the tremor in her hands, and the table was set with the good plates she saved for special occasions, the ones Gary claimed made him feel like the head of a respectable household. Mr. Brown and Miss Eliza arrived just after 6, both in their 70s, both kind in their own ways, and both unaware that Gary had invited them not for company, but for validation. They sat at the table with polite smiles while Gary opened the evening with exaggerated small talk, asking them about their garden and the new mailbox installation down the street. But it was clear from the shine in his eyes that he was eager to shift the conversation toward the topic he had prepared. We had barely begun eating when he leaned back in his chair and let out a loud sigh, placing his fork on the table with theatrical weight, before saying that things had been very difficult lately, because some people in the house did not believe in contributing fairly, and he glanced directly at me as if waiting for applause. My mother stiffened her hand, pausing mid-air as she held a piece of bread, but she said nothing because she knew interrupting him would only make things worse. Gary continued claiming I thought I was too good to pay rent, that I spent my days sitting on my laptop doing nothing meaningful, and that he had been forced to set boundaries because he could no longer support an adult who refused to act like one. His words landed heavily across the table, not because they were true, but because he said them with such confidence as though repetition alone could transform lies into fact. And Mr. Brown shifted uncomfortably, while Miss Eliza offered an awkward smile, clearly unsure how to respond. I took a slow bite of my salad without lifting my eyes, letting his words pass over me like distant noise, because reacting would only fuel his need for validation, and silence was a far sharper response. My mother attempted to redirect the conversation by mentioning the weather, but Gary cut her off and turned back to me with a smirk, saying, "If I was so independent, perhaps I should move out tomorrow, princess." The insult hung in the air, stirring a flicker of emotion in my chest. Not anger, but something colder and more detached. And I lifted my gaze just long enough to meet his without blinking, before saying, "Careful, Gary. You might get what you are asking for." The table fell silent for a moment, the kind of silence that makes everyone hold their breath without meaning to, and I watched his expression shift from triumph to confusion, as if he had not expected me to say anything at all. He recovered quickly, laughing it off in a forced, loud tone that sounded nothing like genuine amusement, but I could see the fracture forming behind his eyes, a crack in the facade he worked so hard to maintain. Dinner continued awkwardly, Gary talking more loudly than necessary, as though volume might regain control of the room, and my mother sat between us looking as though she were bracing for an earthquake. Then his plates were being cleared, and the evening seemed ready to dissolve into strained goodbyes. Mr. Brown paused and looked at me with recognition, saying he thought he had seen a flyer downtown earlier that day, with my face on it. Something about a tech conference featuring local innovators. My fork froze midway to the sink, and my mother turned toward him in surprise, asking gently what kind of flyer he meant. Mr. Brown explained that he had been picking up his medication near the downtown bus stop and noticed a poster showing a lineup of speakers for an event, one of whom looked remarkably like me, and he mentioned this with innocent curiosity, unaware of the tension it created. Gary let out a short, dismissive laugh, waving a hand as if the idea were absurd, saying it was probably someone else, maybe someone who did doodles like me, not realizing he had revealed his fear more than his disbelief. I did not comment, but the glance Mr. Brown gave me suggested he knew exactly what he had seen, and in that small moment, I felt a subtle shift ripple across the table, not loud, not dramatic, but powerful enough to signal that the version of me Gary tried to present was beginning to unravel in front of the very people he had hoped to impress. That awkward dinner with Mr. Brown and Miss Eliza stayed with me long after the dishes were washed and the front door closed behind them, because for the first time someone from outside the house had seen a glimpse of who I really was, instead of the little caricature Gary kept projecting. And I realized that if the truth about my work could leak into the neighborhood by accident, the truth about everything else could be revealed very much on purpose. The idea did not arrive like lightning. It settled in slowly over the next few days, shaping itself into a plan that was not loud or chaotic, but careful and deliberate. And I chose a Sunday on purpose. One of those mild spring Sundays when our Boise cul-de-sac felt like a small stage lawnmowers humming in the distance, kids chalking crooked hopscotch grids on the sidewalk, older neighbors sitting in folding chairs at the edge of their driveways, greeting each other while pretending not to watch every small drama that unfolded on the street. That Sunday morning, I woke earlier than usual, my mind clearer than it had been in months, and instead of rushing to marinate meat or preheat the oven the way I used to whenever Gary expected a big meal, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and opened the spreadsheet again, then transformed the main summary page into a formal invoice aligning the columns, neatly adding a simple header typing, "Invoice for Household Services," provided by Quinn Drew in plain black letters, and at the bottom I placed the total not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, the kind of design I would be proud to send to any client, except this time the client was the man who insisted I contributed nothing. When I finished, I printed 2 copies on the thicker paper we saved for official forms, listening to the soft rhythm of the printer, while the house stayed quiet around me, and when the pages slid out warm and crisp, I set them aside and grabbed my keys, telling my mother I needed to pick up a few things for lunch, her tired nod following me as I walked out the door. At the grocery store, I moved through the aisles with a strange calm, placing in the cart The foods my mother and I actually liked, the things that made her feel stronger on her better days. Fresh salmon, leafy greens, berries, plain yogurt coffee. She could sip without her stomach twisting. Then for Gary, I chose the cheapest frozen dinners I could find. Boxes with faded pictures and long ingredient lists. Meals no one could mistake for love or generosity, just calories and salt, and the bare minimum he had earned. On the conveyor belt, I separated the items the same way I had separated everything in my head, our food on one side, his on the other, and I paid with my own card while the cashier bagged them without comment, unaware that this quiet division was the first visible step of something much larger. Back home, I stored everything in silence, placing my mother's food and mine on the top shelves, already covered with labels bearing my name, then pushing Gary's frozen boxes into the bottom corner of the freezer, unmarked and out of the way. And when I was done, I took the 2 printed invoices and slid one into the cabinet, where we kept the plates, tucking it upright between 2 stacks so that whoever reached in would be forced to touch it, while the second I taped to the inside of the pantry door at eye level, exactly where Gary's hand always landed when he yanked it open to grab a snack and complain about how expensive groceries were. The labels from the previous week still clung to the containers and bottles where I had placed them. But that morning, I went further, taking out the Sharpie and writing new notes for the things he never thought about. A small square label near the breaker box that read "Electric Service," kept active by Quinn for 26 months. Another on the side of the water heater that said "Repair paid by Quinn when it failed last winter," and one more quietly attached to the folder of mortgage statements I left on the edge of the counter. The words "Mortgage interest paid 5 months by Quinn, not Gary," sitting in my neat handwriting like a quiet accusation. My mother watched all of this from her chair at the table, her fingers worrying the corner of a napkin until it frayed. And finally she asked if I was sure about what I was doing, if I understood how angry Gary might become when he saw all of this lined up against the version of reality he had built. Her voice soft, but edged with a fear she could not hide. And I looked at her and said gently that I was not trying to start a fight. I was only following his rules exactly as he had set them, giving him the clean separation he claimed to want, and that sometimes the only way to deal with someone who twisted the truth was to lay every fact out in the open where they could not pretend it was all in my head. She glanced toward the front window where Mr. Brown was already outside, adjusting his sprinkler system, and Ms. Eliza sat in a folding chair with the Sunday paper in her lap. And I knew she was picturing the worst-case scenario: voices raised, doors slammed, neighbors looking on with pity. Yet there was also something new in her eyes, a faint spark of relief, as if part of her was tired of carrying the burden of his image on her shoulders. Gary spent most of the morning in the bedroom, claiming he needed to rest after a hard week, and when he finally shuffled into the kitchen close to noon, he wore the relaxed expression of a man who believed the battle was already won, humming softly as he reached for the coffee, clearly assuming that the end of the month would force me to fold, that the pressure of looming bills would push me to apologize or offer money just to keep peace. He glanced past the labels on the fridge as if they were old news, rolled his eyes at the folder on the counter without opening it, and muttered something about my dramatic bookkeeping, too confident in his own story to imagine it could be challenged. I let him stay inside that illusion a little longer because my plan did not hinge on his mood. It depended on timing, and timing was something I controlled completely. Before starting lunch, I walked down the hall to my room, closed the door behind me without locking it, and opened my digital calendar on the laptop, scrolling to the square marked with that Sunday's date. Then I clicked on 2 in the afternoon and typed a simple reminder: send email to HELOC Bank and Copy Lawyer, adding in the notes section, the account details and Maya's address, so there would be no hesitation later. No searching, just one smooth motion when the notification appeared. As I saved the event and watched the small colored block appear on the screen, I felt a quiet steadiness settle in my chest, the certainty that this was no longer just about labels or feelings. It was about drawing a line in ink and numbers and signatures. And when I looked out the window at the open garages, the neighbors watering their lawns, the children riding bikes in circles, I knew that before the day ended, this quiet little street would witness something Gary would never be able to erase or retell in his favor again. By early afternoon, the house felt strangely still, the air tense. In that way, quiet rooms sometimes are, before something snaps, and while I diced vegetables for my mother's lunch and pretended to occupy myself, I was listening for the familiar sound of her soft slippers moving toward the kitchen, because I knew that moment, the moment she stepped in, expecting to see pots simmering and me apologetically stirring a pan, like I always did on Sundays, would trigger the first crack in the version of reality Gary had enforced for years. When she finally walked in, her steps slowed almost immediately, her breath catching the second she noticed the refrigerator door covered in labels, each one neat and clean against the white surface, little rectangles of truth she had never fully seen laid out so plainly, and she leaned closer, her fingers trembling as she traced the words with a cautious touch. Paid by Quinn. Not from Gary's budget, covered by Quinn. Since 2021, all the silent receipts of her life written in ink for the first time. Her eyes moved upward to the cabinet where I had taped a full-size sheet, the bold heading Household Expenses, covered by Quinn Drew, 2021 to 2024, jumping out at her with a certainty that allowed no denial, and I could see the shock spreading across her face as she opened the cabinet door to read it more closely. Her body stiffening as she took in the columns and the rows, each line item, precise utilities, prescriptions, repairs, groceries, medical visits, doctor copays, small emergencies, she had whispered about in the living room while apologizing for being such a burden, never once realizing she was reading a history of sacrifices I had already absorbed without asking her for a single cent. She stepped back as if something inside her had twisted. Then she reached for the larger sheet taped to the pantry, and when she pulled the door open and saw the bold total printed at the bottom, $48,371.12. Her lips parted in disbelief, her free hand flying to her chest as if bracing her heart from the weight of it, and for a moment she simply stared, her breath shallow, her eyes darting over the breakdown again and again, as though she needed to confirm that the number was real, that she had not imagined it, or exaggerated it, or misunderstood it the way she often attempted to soften the truth about Gary's behavior. Her fingers trembled hard enough that I reached out instinctively, ready to steady her. But before I could, she took in a sharp breath, and then everything inside her erupted at once. Years of holding back, years of shrinking herself to avoid making trouble, years of swallowing Gary's commands, all of it boiling to the surface as she threw her head back and screamed. It was not a normal, startled scream. It was a raw, piercing sound that sliced through the house and shot straight out the open window, echoing across the yard with a force I had never heard from her. And in an instant the hum of the neighborhood paused. Sprinklers stilled mid-arc birds, scattered from fences, and I saw Mr. Brown look up sharply from his driveway while Miss Eliza lowered her newspaper and leaned forward, trying to see through our window. My mother clutched the paper so tightly it wrinkled, and with a voice that shook with outrage and betrayal, she yelled again, louder, her voice breaking on the final word, "Gary, get in here now!" The sound rattled the air, spreading through the yard until a couple walking their dog a few houses down slowed and exchanged glances before drifting closer as if drawn by the gravity of a storm. Gary stomped into the kitchen. Moments later, visibly irritated, ready to scold her for overreacting, but he froze halfway through the doorway when he realized she was not simply upset. She was trembling with fury. Her jaw clenched, her eyes bright with something sharper than disbelief, and she thrust the paper at him with a force that made him recoil before she demanded he read it out loud. He stared at the sheet, confused, squinting at the columns as though the words refused to arrange themselves into something he could accept, and my mother's voice rose again. This time, not in a scream, but in that hard tone she rarely used. "Read it." Gary read every line. I stepped into view, then standing beside her with my tablet already powered on the Excel file glowing against the screen. And while he continued to stammer, I tapped the corner of the tablet, initiating the screen mirroring prompt I had prepared earlier, because if Gary wanted to pretend he paid for everything, then the truth deserved an audience. The television in the living room blinked from a dark idle screen to a bright projection of the spreadsheet, the rows expanding and filling the screen until there was no space left for excuse or distortion. And it happened at the exact moment two neighbors, drawn by my mother's scream and the tension spilling from our open door, stepped inside without thinking, both of them wide-eyed as the numbers filled the TV. Emergency room bill, Linda Drew, paid by Quinn Drew, $3,200. Roof deposit, paid by Quinn. $8,700 groceries for the month of December, paid by Quinn, $398, and line after line after line, exposing every lie Gary had ever told about being the only provider. My mother turned to him again, her voice trembling not from fear but from rage that had taken far too long to rise, and she demanded that he explain every number, every withdrawal, every deception he had wrapped in the language of authority and sacrifice. But Gary could barely form words, his mouth opening then closing as his face drained of color. I watched his eyes flick to Mr. Brown and Mrs. Eliza, who stood frozen in the doorway, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning realization. And in that moment, the kitchen transformed, completely no longer the place where I chopped herbs or packed lunches, but a courtroom with the evidence displayed publicly and the verdict already forming among the witnesses. The neighbors exchanged glances, Mr. Brown muttering something under his breath as he leaned in closer to make sense of the figures glowing on the screen. And I felt the quiet shift of power settle into my bones, not in a triumphant way, but in the way truth finally does when it has been buried for too long. My mother looked from the screen to Gary and said with a voice that no longer shook, "You have been taking advantage of my daughter while calling her a burden." And while Gary tried to step forward as if to shut the TV off, I stood in his path, meeting his eyes calmly, my finger still resting on the tablet, ready to scroll down to the next damning line, if he dared deny even a syllable of what was now fully visible to the people he had spent years trying to impress. The living room felt brighter than usual as the spreadsheet filled the TV, the white background almost glaring in the afternoon sun that streamed through the blinds, illuminating every row of numbers as if the house itself wanted to expose the truth. And while the columns loaded and expanded one by one, I watched the neighbors inch farther inside their curiosity, overcoming their hesitation, their faces contorting, as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The first line that pulled their attention was bold and unmistakable. Emergency room bill, Linda Drew, paid by Quinn Drew, $3,200, and I heard Mr. Brown mutter under his breath as he leaned closer, squinting at the screen with disbelief that bordered on irritation, not at me, but at the man standing a few feet away trying desperately to maintain composure. The next line appeared a second later as I scrolled slightly. New roof deposit paid by Quinn Drew, $8,700. And this time it was Miss Eliza, who let out a quiet gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as she whispered something like, "I thought Gary said he handled all that," her voice soft but heavy with the weight of a neighbor, finally understanding the real shape of a marriage she had been watching from across trimmed lawns for years. Gary swallowed hard, the sound almost audible in the tense room, and he forced out a weak laugh that fooled no one, saying, "Well, I mean, I was going to pay her back eventually. You know how it is with timing and bills piling up, trying to make the words sound casual and well-intentioned, even though every number behind him contradicted every syllable he uttered." Mr. Brown shook his head slowly, still staring at the TV as if the truth on the screen offended him personally. Then he looked at Gary with a disappointed tilt of his chin and said quietly, "I thought you told us you paid for everything." And there was something so calm, yet cutting in his tone, that it made Gary stiffen like a child being scolded in public. I stepped a little closer, then the tablet still warm in my hand, and with a voice steady enough that even my mother glanced up in startled admiration. "I said you gave me an invoice for existing here, Gary. I simply brought my own," and the words floated in the air like a line from a courtroom transcript, simple and factual and impossible to twist. Linda stood near the pantry door, her eyes rimmed with red yet frighteningly clear, the shock of the last few minutes sharpening into something colder than anger, something that cracked through years of silence, and she turned to Gary with her voice trembling, not because she was afraid, but because she was trying to hold back tears of disbelief as she asked, "Did you really use her name for that line of credit without telling her?" Gary opened and closed his mouth like a fish, gasping for oxygen, searching for an explanation that did not exist, and all he managed was a series of broken phrases. "I mean, it was just paperwork, you know how banks are. They needed another signer. It was supposed to be temporary." "You are making it sound worse than it was," but the room felt too full of truth for any lie to survive in it now. I saw the moment the neighbors pieced it together. The HELOC, the hidden signature, the new TV that everyone in the cul-de-sac had quietly admired during last year's game night, the way Gary bragged about being the one who kept the house running, all of those assumptions collapsing into a realization that the man who strutted around calling himself the head of the household had been draining resources from the very person he called a burden. My mother swayed slightly, the shock pounding through her until her knees weakened, and I moved to support her, but she lifted a hand to stop me. The gesture small yet firm, as if she needed to remain standing to witness every second of the truth unraveling. The tension in Gary's face twisted into anger as he tried to regain control, snapping something about exaggerated numbers and misunderstandings, but I was already reaching into the drawer near the counter, pulling out the plain white envelope I had tucked there earlier, the final proof I knew would silence everything he intended to say. I stepped back into the center of the kitchen and held the envelope where everyone could see. Then I opened it slowly and pulled out the documents inside crisp papers with official headers and notarized signatures, and I handed them to my mother without a word. She unfolded them carefully, her hands still unsteady, her eyes scanning the print, before widening in shock, deeper than anything she had shown yet, and I watched her breathe out a broken whisper that seemed to collapse years of pain at once, because the papers she held were from the trust I had created a year earlier, a financial shield built quietly and deliberately with $500,000 in invested assets, a trust she was the sole beneficiary of, fully legally protected and completely out of Gary's reach. I explained softly before he could twist it that this was money I had earned, saved, and invested, that I had created the trust in her name, because I wanted her safe, because I knew she had spent her entire life with men who thought providing financially entitled them to control her, and that I had no intention of letting her retirement, her health care, or her stability ever depend on someone who viewed dependence as a leash. My mother's breath hitched as she stared at the papers again, and then she looked at Gary with a crushed expression that held more sorrow than anger, finally seeing that while she had been worried about keeping the peace, he had been breaking the foundation beneath her, and she said quietly, "You tried to take from the only person who has ever truly taken care of me." Gary staggered back a step, his face draining of color, not because he felt guilt, but because he understood the implications. The house, the finances, the reputation he guarded so fiercely, all eroding under the truth, in front of him and the neighbors, standing only a few feet away, witnessing every second of it. My mother sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the revelation of what I had carried in silence: the trust, the bills, the sacrifices, and the knowledge that the man she had defended for years had been dismantling her security behind her back. And as she lowered her head into her trembling hands, the room felt impossibly quiet, except for the numbers still glowing on the screen numbers that spoke more loudly than any argument ever could. The kitchen stayed painfully quiet for a long moment after my mother sank into the chair, her fingers still gripping the trust papers as though they were the last solid surface in a world that had suddenly tilted, and the silence settled over all of us like dust after a collapse, heavy and unavoidable, while the numbers on the TV glowed behind us like a spotlight trained on the truth Gary had spent years burying under his pride. I stood there holding the tablet, feeling something shift inside me, a calm that did not feel triumphant or vengeful, but resolute. The kind of certainty that arrives only after you have seen a person reveal exactly who they are, with no room left for excuses or hope that they might still change. And I realized that this was where the line finally ended. I took a slow breath and turned fully toward Gary, who still hovered near the pantry, as if waiting for someone to contradict what the screen showed, and with a voice steady enough that even my mother looked up at me, I said, "You wanted separate budgets, Gary, from today. I am no longer funding anything in this house." The words landed between us like a heavy tile hitting the floor, and he blinked as though trying to decide whether to laugh or yell. But before he could find either reaction, I continued explaining that as of that morning, I had removed every auto pay link associated with my accounts, that the electric bill and internet bill and water bill now sat solely under his name, because he had insisted he was the only provider here, and that I had already spoken to the bank to formally revoke consent for any future credit activity tied to my identity, which meant that no new loan or refinance or line of credit could move forward without my explicit signature, and that signature would never come. My mother stared at me, her lips parting in surprise and something like awe, and then she turned to Gary with her voice rising for the first time in years as she said, "You have been stealing from my child while calling her a freeloader," her tone cracking on the last word, not because she doubted it, but because she finally understood the depth of what he had taken from both of us. Mr. Brown shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, his eyes locked on Gary with a look that radiated something close to disgust, and even Miss Eliza, who always tried to give people the benefit of the doubt, crossed her arms and stepped back as though distancing herself from the shame radiating off him, the illusion of the hard-working, responsible stepfather dissolving entirely in the presence of undeniable evidence. I left them standing there and walked to my room, my steps slow and deliberate, and as I packed my clothes into the small suitcase I kept in the closet, I felt a strange stillness settle inside me. Not numbness, but a quiet readiness, as I folded shirts and zipped compartments with the ease of someone who had subconsciously prepared for this for years. When I carried the suitcase through the living room a few minutes later, the neighbor stepped aside watching as I walked past the TV, still displaying line after line of expenses I had carried alone. And as I opened the front door, they followed with their eyes, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and grim validation, that everything they had just witnessed was not exaggerated or embellished, but the simple truth of how Gary treated the people who loved him most. I rolled the suitcase to the driveway where my SUV sat idling in the early evening light, the same SUV no one in the neighborhood had ever questioned because they assumed it was a hand-me-down family car. But when I pressed the unlock button, the headlights blinked in a pattern that revealed a small detail many people missed: the license plate frame engraved with the name of my business, Quinn Drew, UX LLC, making it clear for the first time that the car was mine, paid for by my work and registered under my company. Gary followed me outside, panic finally cracking through the arrogance he had held onto all afternoon. And he grabbed the door frame as he tried to stop me, saying, "Quinn, do not you dare walk out on your mother," as if invoking her would guilt me back into the version of myself that complied and swallowed my own needs to keep peace. I turned toward him with a calm he did not expect and said, "I am not walking out on her. I am walking out on you, and I have already made sure she will be fine without you." And as I said it, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small silver key attached to a simple blue tag, placing it gently into my mother's hand as she stepped onto the porch with unsteady legs. She looked at the key, confused, her brows pulling together as though afraid to hope for anything, and I told her that the key belonged to a 2-bedroom apartment across town, a place with good light and quiet neighbors and an elevator, so she would not strain herself on the stairs, a place fully paid for and placed in her trust, so she never had to worry about rent or mortgages or Gary's temper again. Her hand flew to her mouth as the reality of what I said washed over her, her eyes filling with tears that were not from pain, but from relief so powerful it nearly buckled her knees, and she whispered, "How long have you had this?" And I answered, honestly telling her I had set it up months ago, because I saw the way she flinched when Gary raised his voice, the way she hid her prescriptions under mail so he would not comment on the cost, the way she had shrunk herself to avoid setting him off. The neighbors watched in breathless silence as my mother clutched the key like a lifeline, and Gary sputtered something about manipulation and disrespect. But no one looked at him anymore. Not even the neighbors who had once greeted him with friendly waves across the lawn, because all they saw now was a man whose pride had been built on the labor of the daughter he belittled. I placed my suitcase in the back seat, closed the hatch with a firm click, and as I stepped into the driver's seat, I felt the weight of years lifting from my shoulders, the kind of lightness that comes only when you stop living in someone else's narrative and begin writing your own. My mother stood at the edge of the driveway clutching the key while the sunset cast a soft glow around her, and for the first time in a long time, she did not look afraid or exhausted. She looked free, and as I started the engine, I knew that leaving was not an ending, but the beginning of the life she and I deserved, separate budgets. Yes, but separate lives too, and for once that separation meant freedom, not punishment. 3 months passed with a kind of quiet momentum that felt almost unreal after the chaos of that Sunday, as though the universe had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled, clearing the fog I had been walking through since childhood, and by the time June arrived, I was living in a bright apartment in downtown Seattle, a place with high ceilings and tall windows that framed the skyline like a moving painting. The kind of home I used to scroll past online, thinking it belonged only to people who had not spent their 20s managing other people's crises. Each morning I walked to a co-working space a few blocks away, the kind filled with warm light and the low hum of focused conversations, and I would sit near the window overlooking Elliott Bay, working on contracts with SaaS clients from Austin and San Francisco, quietly thriving in ways no one from my old neighborhood would have ever imagined, because I did not need to tell them in order for it to be real. My mother had moved into the apartment I had prepared for her weeks earlier, settling into the space with cautious steps, at first carefully unpacking dishes and photo frames as if afraid someone might knock on the door and tell her she was not allowed to live a life without fear. But day by day, I watched her shoulders drop, her smile return her breathing ease, and eventually she stopped jumping whenever her phone buzzed, because she no longer lived with the man who used anger the way other men used a hammer swinging at anything that threatened his pride. She filed for legal separation quietly with Maya's help, and though she did not tell many of her friends right away, the relief in her voice each time we talked on the phone made it clear that she was rediscovering parts of herself Gary had buried under years of belittling questions and controlling habits. Meanwhile, Gary's life unraveled with the same speed and inevitability as a rope fraying under its own tension, because the mortgage he had insisted was solely his responsibility became impossible to manage once my contributions disappeared, and within 2 months the house went into foreclosure, a foreclosure notice taped to the front door that the neighbors saw before he could take it down, leaving him with nowhere to hide from the embarrassment he had created with his own lies. The friends who used to gather in his driveway with beers and sports jokes slowly drifted away, not because they suddenly wanted to take my side, but because gossip travels fast in Boise, especially when it includes phrases like hidden credit lines and forged signatures, and the numbers that had been broadcast onto my mother's television for the whole neighborhood to see, numbers that made even the most polite neighbor lower their eyes when Gary walked past with that stiff pride he tried to glue back together. He must have tried to reach my mother first, but she ignored every attempt, blocking each number the moment it appeared, and eventually the only person he could still try to guilt or manipulate was me. Though I had learned to see his tactics with a clarity that left no room for softness. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, as I reviewed a project proposal in the Keo working lounge, my phone buzzed with a FaceTime request from an unfamiliar number, and I almost declined it immediately, assuming it was a client or spam. But something made me look closer, and I recognized the shadowed outline of his shoulders in the tiny preview window, the slumped posture of a man whose authority had run out. I answered without moving from my chair, the camera showing only my face and a slice of the Seattle skyline behind me. And for a moment, Gary did not speak, his eyes darting around as if trying to process the fact that I was not in Boise, not sitting at the old kitchen table he used to claim as his throne, not waiting for him to speak first. His voice softened unnaturally as he finally said, "Quinn, I am sorry I went too far. I did not realize how much you were actually doing. I should have appreciated it. I should have listened." And he paused, swallowing hard before adding, "I need help just this once. Just a small loan to get back on my feet. I am losing everything, and I know you are the only one who can understand." I listened without interrupting him, letting the words hang between us, because there was nothing new in them, only the same entitlement dressed in apology, the same expectation that I would pick up the pieces for him the way he had once demanded I pick up his bills. And when he finished speaking, I took a breath, my voice steady and quiet as I said, "Separate budgets. Remember, you made it very clear." The flicker of hope in his eyes extinguished, instantly replaced by the stunned look of a man who has finally realized the door he slammed shut behind him could no longer be opened, no matter how softly he knocked. And I ended the call before he could gather another pleading sentence, setting the phone face down on the table while my heartbeat remained calm and steady, not racing with guilt or triumph, just certainty. I opened my laptop to continue working, but before I could begin again, a new email notification blinked in the corner of the screen, a subject line that made my breath catch for an entirely different reason. "Women in Tech Summit. Your talk has reached 2 million views. Congratulations." And for a moment, I just stared at those words, letting them settle into my mind as the quiet opposite of everything Gary had ever claimed about me. My talk, the one I had almost turned down because my mother needed care, the one that had become a last-minute remote session from my tiny Boise bedroom, had taken off like wildfire, resonating with women across the industry. And now, there it was, undeniable evidence that the life I rebuilt was not only stable, but thriving in ways that Gary's limited vision could never have imagined. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sunlight hit my face through the tall windows, and allowed myself a small smile because everything he had lost, he had destroyed with his own hands, and everything I had gained, I had built with mine. What would you say if someone who humiliated you publicly came back begging, "I really want to know," in the comments? In the quiet months that followed Gary's unraveling, I found myself returning again and again to the memory of that first moment when he slid the invoice across the dinner table, the absurd list of charges meant to humiliate me, the way he said I would have to pay to breathe in the house, as if my entire existence was some burden he had carried alone. And it felt surreal now to compare that moment with the night his own deceptions collapsed under the weight of the invoices I created, the spreadsheets that exposed every dollar I had poured into the home he claimed as solely his, and the trust documents that showed how I had secured my mother's future without a cent of his involvement. The journey from being called a freeloader to becoming a woman whose career reached millions, whose savings were the result of discipline and strategy rather than luck, and whose choices finally aligned with her sense of worth, felt like stepping out of a dim hallway into a bright open street, and each day I lived in Seattle deepened that contrast further, turning what once felt like a small victory into a lasting sense of peace. My mother visited often, sometimes staying for days at a time, and during one of those visits, as we sat at my kitchen island sharing tea, she reached across the counter and took my hand gently, her eyes softer than I had seen them in years, and she said, "Quinn, I stayed quiet for too long because I was afraid of being alone, and I am sorry for every time my silence left you standing in front of him by yourself." Her voice trembled, but not with fear. Now it trembled with honesty, the kind that reveals regret, but also healing. And I told her that she was not alone anymore, and she never had to choose between safety and dignity again because we were building a life that protected both. We spent the following weeks rearranging the rhythms of our relationship, learning how to live without the constant background noise of Gary's moods, learning that we could cook dinner without bracing for criticism, that we could discuss finances without someone accusing us of overspending, and that we could simply exist in a shared space without shrinking ourselves to fit into another person's fragile ego. And those simple changes slowly rewrote what home meant for both of us. As I settled more deeply into my new routines, I understood something that had always existed beneath the surface of my story. Something I had felt but never fully articulated until I was far enough away to see the pattern clearly, that the pain I grew up witnessing in my mother was not unique to her, that it was part of a broader story lived by countless women before her. Women who were conditioned to give without limit, to fold themselves into smaller shapes so their partners could occupy the entire room, to handle every invisible task while being told they contributed nothing, and to stay silent out of fear of loneliness, judgment, or financial ruin. The revelation struck me slowly but powerfully that this cycle of sacrifice and dismissal could have continued into my own life if I had not stopped it with something as mundane yet revolutionary as spreadsheets and boundaries, and it made me realize that the tools I used to protect myself were not dramatic or violent, but simple logical, grounded in documentation and self-respect. The kind of tools women are rarely taught to wield, even though they are often the most effective weapons we have. Saving receipts, tracking bills, reading contracts, knowing what our names are attached to refusing to apologize for asking questions. These acts may seem small, but they are the threads that stitch together a new kind of strength, one that does not shout to be heard, one that does not rely on revenge through destruction, but on rebuilding through clarity. And in that way, my revenge was quiet but unmistakable. The peace that followed was louder than any confrontation ever could have been, not because I announced it, but because it echoed in every space Gary could no longer reach, every room where my mother breathed without fear. Every morning I woke up without the weight of someone else's resentment on my shoulders, and every time I opened my laptop to find new opportunities instead of new problems created by the man who once claimed to be the only adult in the house. Looking back, I realized that Gary had been right about one thing, and the thought of it made me almost smile, because he had told me that it was time to stop letting someone live a comfortable life at someone else's expense, and he was absolutely right. He simply never imagined that the person whose comfort would end was his. His words had been meant as an insult, a warning, a threat even, but they became the prophecy of his own downfall. The line that marked the beginning of my freedom and the end of his unchecked dominance. And there was a poetic justice in that reversal that required no gloating from me. So now when I tell this story, I do it not to relive the pain, but to show what can happen when one woman refuses to accept the narrative forced upon her, when she chooses truth over fear, documentation over chaos, boundaries over appeasement, and dignity over silence. And if you are listening to this and see your own reflection or the reflection of your daughter or your mother in these moments, I hope it reminds you that invisible work is still work and invisible wealth is still wealth. And the moment you decide to protect it is the moment your life begins to change. If Quinn's story felt like watching your own reflection or your daughter's, tell me in the comments. And if you believe women's invisible work and invisible wealth deserve to be seen, hit subscribe so more stories like this do not stay hidden.